Hey gang, Kevin here, Life22, and it's another day in the life, right? It's the day after Christmas, and we are, sporting the new Christmas gifts, the First Amendment hat from PragerU, and here we go. Drinking some Toasted Box, Leinenkugel. Thank you, Uncle Tony, down at the Allegheny Redemption Center, for having such a great selection of delicious beers. Yesterday was Leinenkugel's toasted, or chocolate stout, or something like that. Yeah, chocolate dunkel. And those were delicious. And so I bought two 12-packs, one for Christmas and one to finish Christmas off and bleed into the next day. And then also got a backup water right here with the mug that Miss June made for me. Took some ideas that I had in collaboration with her abilities, and put my absolute favorite on there is the Joey Coco Diaz quote about chicken wings, but got water as backup. So, but today's video is literally the review that has been held off for a couple weeks, just because a couple weeks, just because I didn't have time to give you like an. I have a feeling this is going to burn into an hour, and hopefully I can keep it under 30 minutes. This is The Quest for Cosmic Justice. Thus far, this is my most favorite Thomas Sowell book. Thomas Sowell, the great economist. Wrote this book in like the early 90s, and we can check that out too and find out when exactly he wrote this book. But the fact that he wrote this book in the early 90s, and almost everything in it is some piece of bullshit that is portrayed in the world today, which is humorous to me. I find that very funny. Let's see here. So, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, book by Thomas Sowell, written in summary overview. Excuse me. Published 1996, December of. So, we're almost 30 years old on this book. We're like 25 years? Yeah, we're like the 25-year mark. Is this stand right? Yeah. Yeah, we're at the 25-year mark on this book. And it's funny that this is the same. Everything he talks about being incorrect from, and explaining why certain things are incorrect, like universal basic income. Now he uses different terms, but essentially it's the same stuff. Why socialism doesn't work, and we're going to get into that here in a second. But this was a 16-hour read or listen, and it is by far my favorite Thomas Sowell book. And I recommend it for everybody, whether you're trying to change the mind of your lib friends, or you're trying to gain knowledge, or maybe you are a liberal and trying to work your way back off of the, wean yourself back to reality. So, I started taking notes about Chapter 3, because that was when the book started to really, cling to me. Man is not God at the beginning of creation. Oh, okay. These are just rough notes at the beginning, and then I started actually taking quotes. Let's see here. So Chapter 3, man is not God. And at the beginning, man is not God at the beginning of creation, of the creation, and let there be justice. It's been so long since I finished it, but he talks about how we can all agree that all men are created equal, but we all don't end up in the same place. So if anybody remembers the Kamala Harris advertisement the day before the election in last November, November 2020, and how like it's not about starting out at the same place. It's that we all end up at the same place. That's communism. Like so and then he kind of goes into a let's see here, the weight of costs, right, in an economy, or also for moral value, for a cosmic justice standpoint, right? Like for justice in general, you can't say, it costs more to, and he brings this one up. He goes, it costs more to send goods to lower income neighborhoods, which are typically, and he quotes statistics, have higher levels of violent crime. Okay, well, the cost of that the cost of the goods go up because of the costs, the risk associated with that. And he brings that up and he goes, so, you can't forego costs. Costs weigh into everything. That's what I wrote in. Costs weigh in. So you say we want to lower the price to deliver goods to impoverished neighborhoods that have high occurrences of violent crime to truck drivers, right? Okay, well, how do you lower the price? So either the government subsidizes it, or you have to forego a cost, and the cost you're foregoing is dead truck drivers. And he actually brings that up, and it's a very valid point, because you have to charge more because your drivers need to be compensated accordingly. They have to have body armor, carry probably weapons. They might need to have additional members of their crew for security purposes. Maybe they need a security detail, depending on what it is or where they're going. They need to have full bennies, like life insurance policies and stuff like that. So in the event that they do get murdered on the streets of some inner city in Detroit or Chicago, their family's taken care of, because now all of a sudden the one of two, or the sole bread earner for the family, is now dead, right? Because they delivered a good that the government insisted be delivered to an impoverished neighborhood. Which actually brings me back to like the riots of 2020, when there was a poor little old lady. She was African American. She was on the news and she was crying during the riot. She was like, "This is ridiculous." She goes, "I don't know why people are rioting." She goes, "This is nuts. They're not attacking. If their beef is with old rich white men, they're not burning down old rich white men's houses. They're burning down my neighborhood." And they burnt down, and she was like sobbing to the news reporter out in front of the smoldering Dollar General. She goes, "I get all my groceries from there. It's the only place in town it's the only place walking distance where I don't have a car to get groceries." And they burn it down, right? And guess what? They Dollar General might not rebuild there, and now that little lady has to either move or figure out something else. She's not going to starve to death. I mean, but I mean, those are things that are brought up in this chapter 3. He talks about Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court justice. Clumsy people held to our justice, not cosmic. Our systems should be doling out cosmic. Okay, let's see. My notes are ridiculous sometimes when I write them down and I understand them, and then like 2 weeks goes by and I have no idea. So people are held to our justice, not cosmic. Our system should not be doling out cosmic justice. So he talks about the clumsy person, right? The clumsy person, stumbles and bumbles around, and they're held, they're at a higher risk of doing something dumb. Now, like, just because they're clumsy, right? And they run over a person, that, the cost, again, weighing into costs, the cost of doling out, that person may not be held to cosmic justice because they're clumsy, but they still have to be held to justice, right? Because even though it was an accident, your clumsiness ended up resulting in the death of somebody else, right? So you still have to, your clumsiness, just like curiosity, if your curiosity gets you somewhere that gets you killed, like, guess what? You essentially have earned that cosmic justice for it, right? So, or that sense of justice, right? So that's it's shouldn't have been curious, right? Well, maybe your curiosity made you lots of money in other areas, but it has killed you here. That's kind of what he's getting at. And Oliver Wendell Holmes brings up he quotes a conversation with Oliver Wendell Holmes in that, and I think there's another one later in the. I got like 2.5 pages of notes here. No, okay, the backside of that one's blank. So I have 2.5 pages. Not back to back, just so. In an absolute, okay, so he talks about this part right here, which is really cool. So, 300 passengers, 200 life jackets. What is the just thing? The just thing is something that none of us could live with, being moral people, right? Because the absolute just thing, if you have 300 passengers and 200 life jackets, the only just thing is that all 300 people drowned. Let that sink in. Because it took me, like, yeah, that makes sense. Because, right, like, the just thing is to treat all those people as if they were equal. And because they're all equal, you cannot judge which people would survive. So the only just thing to do, because somebody else losing their life would not be just, right? That 100 people losing their life would not be just over the other 200 people. Hence, the only just thing would be to allow all 300 people to drown and take the life jackets away, right? And that's a cruel thing. That's why none of us live by that standard. And so he goes into a moral, prefer. Okay, so right here I write down the word. We would prefer the 200 people to live out of 3. So 100 people would lose their lives, and that's sad. Now, then he goes, you could go down a rabbit hole and say, okay, well, which ones? Should it be women and children? And actually, and he points out that almost every single one of us would be happy, is even if it was 100, the 300 passengers, 150 of them are good people, and 150 of them are ruthless, sinister, horrible people. We would be content if that all 150 ruthless people survived and 50 of the good, moral, just people lived. Because even that is more of a better outcome from a moral standpoint and a less just standpoint than letting all 300 people die. And yes. Now, and is it more practical that all 150 sinister people would live? Well, more than likely, yeah. Those bastards are the ones pushing little old ladies out of the way to get to a life jacket, tearing one out of the arms of a child, right? Like those. So those would be the people that would live anyways, because we're not here and we're not there in the hypothetical. We could look at it from an outside perspective, but we're not on the boat, right? It is what it is. Because also a more moral, a just person, let's say that's a very old man, would give up his life jacket to a young child, regardless of the child's moral aptitude, right? That's so the more moral people would most likely forego the life jacket, sacrificing their own life anyways. So hence, the more ruthless would survive, right? Like even the greedy jerk off that's taken the life jacket from a child or a pregnant mother or whatever. Like it is what it is. So these are all just like good things to think about when you're thinking about justice, especially because this book was written in '96, and the social media justice warriors weren't even born. And it's just, their crusade is born now. And or is coming to fruition now. And it's funny that this book actually like talks about the BS of the social justice, the cosmic justice, right there. And he talks about, like, he goes into statistics, right? Like the statistics of, affirmative action and, different, different groups being statistically underrepresented, and how you can say something exists when it doesn't. And he mentions an old proverb: the dog with his bone. Reflect and drops his bone. Okay. So there's a dog that has a bone, and he looks into a pond, and he sees his reflection, and he sees another dog. Well, to him, it's another dog with a bigger bone, and in an attempt to snatch the other dog's bone away, he must drop his own bone. And he drops his bone into the pond and loses his bone, and then goes for the other dog's bone and is clearly unsuccessful because the other dog is a reflection, and the bone isn't bigger, and now he is stuck with no bone. And his interpretation of that was, do not lose the attainable in pursuit of the unattainable. It's another good thing to soak in. If you lower your standards at school, you lower your if you lower standards at school, you will lower short-term issues, but create long-term issues. Now, so some of those first ones were in chapter 3, because the next time I actually wrote down a chapter was 10, which is in 2 bullet points from now. So I'm assuming somewhere between 3 and 10, a lot of these existed. And I just didn't write down the chapters. So, which you're gonna read the book anyways. So why do you care what chapter to find this stuff on? Because you're gonna read the whole damn book, as you should, because it's a great book. So, and actually, it's funny that this was brought up, because this is brought up now, right? We, certain groups of marginalized communities are failing the high standards set at schools, and so they keep lowering the bar, and they've been lowering the bar since pre-1996, and they're continuing to lower the bar. And this lower bar is solving the short-term issues that, like, because those marginalized communities, guess what? Most likely they are that, maybe the neighbors or the relatives of that little old lady that we talked about that had the Dollar General burnt down, right? She lives in an impoverished neighborhood, and impoverished neighborhoods have high crime, and high crime leads to greater distraction, priorities to shift. School's not as important as getting food, surviving, right? Like, so, and so, like, all of a sudden, the students, the pupils do not get to go to school and study because they have to work an after-school job, or maybe they have to come home and defend their homestead, that just because that's how it is. They got to go deliver groceries after work to little old ladies who can't walk 20 blocks to the nearest grocery store. They were only able to walk 3. Now there's no Dollar General. So these students don't study at school because their priorities have shifted. And because their priorities have shifted, you don't have they're not going to pass a rigid standard for the education system, which is fine. It's perfectly fine. And they can catch up on that later in life, or they must, or they will be obsolete. That's how it is. Evolve or become irrelevant. Which I just took a quote from Grandmaster Broughton on that one. So if you keep lowering the standards, these students whose priorities are not school, they're the other issues. And if you try to solve those other issues, you're going to have greater benefit. Now they if you lower the standards, they'll pass the lower bar. The problem is, are they really learning anything? Or all you're doing is setting your test to the lowest bar holder, and not challenging the other pupils in the room to do more. And so there's that. And then you create the long-term issue where those other students aren't challenged. You get a lot of chaff mixed with your wheat. You're not setting aside. Inequality is not such a bad thing, because guess what? If a poor person is going to be a rich person, but you've removed inequality, inequality is what separates rich from poor, successful from unsuccessful. If everybody was successful, then it wouldn't mean anything. If everybody was rich and no one was poor, then everybody would be neither. You would not be rich nor poor. You would have no goals. Because if everybody was the same, then there would be no goals. There would be nothing for you to achieve, because achievement would be worth nothing. And so what you'd find out is not everybody's rich. No. It would just be like, and I'm forgetting her name, Chang Ping. Anyway, she was on Dennis Prager's Fireside Chat, and she came from North Korea. And she said inequality in this country was one of the greatest things she had ever seen, because there's no inequality in North Korea. Yeah, you're either dirty poor or you're dirty poor. And that is the truth. You're not going to have everyone's super rich and everyone's super rich, because then you would have nobody doing any work for you. If your custodial staff is super rich, then why the hell would they do anything? Why would they go clean your toilets? Why would they take your garbage out? Why would they mow your lawn? Right? Because they're super rich. They don't have to. They can pay somebody else to do it. But if everybody's super rich, or if everybody's rich, then you wouldn't have that. What ends up happening is that we just redefine terms, and you take the term rich and poor, and you move them up. So what happens is the standard of living for poor people becomes greater, and the standard of living for rich people stays about the same. But everybody's, so like the invention, as the economy goes through its ebbs and flows, you end up successful companies invest into R&D, research and development, and those companies develop things like air conditioners, in-home refrigeration, a phone, the smartphone that everybody has. It's funny that, like, we talk about how everybody's poor in this country. There's a whole pile of impoverished people in this country, and yada yada yada. But you know what? None of them are starving to death, because even like every single one of them, almost every single one of them, that is like on the fringes of the poor, the government's already handled them. Like, as much as I'm opposed to a lot of like handout programs, the government's already handled them. They've been handing them food stamps so they don't starve to death. And the Obama phone program handed everybody a phone. And you can actually upgrade that phone to a smartphone, and a lot of people have, or they get subsidies from the government. You'd be surprised how many tenants that I have that their rents come from government subsidies. They get food stamps, they get heat subsidies, they get all this other stuff, and every single one of them has a phone that is either paid for by a government program, given to them by a government program, or they get cash from a government program to pay expenditures like phones and things like that. So, and almost every single one of them, unless they are technologically uninclined, like some of the older tenants, that just the flip phone is probably well outside of the realm of their understanding. My father was that way. He taught me how to build a computer, and when I was 6, and you know, he was really into it, and then all of a sudden it kind of just dropped off for him, and you know, like he had a box Nokia, and getting him a flip phone was like the hardest thing, and even then, when he had a box Nokia going into a flip phone, going into an Android, the entire time he could never reply to a text message. He didn't understand that there was a different there's a different directory to go into for a text message. So, anyways, we're going on a tangent. Those, what ends up happening though is the standard of living goes up for everybody. So now, all of a sudden, the poor of the poor now are not living in substandard living conditions. And the substandard today is not what it was 100 years ago. It's not what it was 20 years ago. And the conditions, the amenities that people have. Like, and he goes into this further in where he talks, and we'll get into that. But so if you lower these standards at the school districts, you're going to create more long-term issues. You're going to have less educated people as a whole to satisfy a small, marginalized group. And so why should why should the cost be borne to everybody else? Makes sense, right? Like, that's the just thing would be to have no one get an education. Okay, and then he talks about communities and how respect is like currency and inflation kills. And that was pretty good, because if you just start handing respect out to everybody, you inflate what respect is worth. And I thought that was a really good point. Respect is like currency. You go do your neighbor a favor, and then you do your neighbor a favor, and your favorite neighbor does a favor for you, and it builds respect amongst neighbors, right? Goodwill. But then all of a sudden, if respect isn't worth anything because you've inflated the currency of respect, then respect isn't worth anything. Inflation kills. Inflation kills the dollar. Inflation kills respect. Inflation kills a lot of things that you hold as currency. The value of your time, whether you put it in dollars or not, I mean, it's still inflatable. So, that was good. Chapter 10. This is where I wrote this down. The entirety of chapter 10 should be listened to. It is like 10 or 20 minutes. I think it's 10 minutes. It like sums everything up. It talks about equality. Different economic groups, different cultural groups, statistically have different outcomes, right? Like Russian ballerinas are statistically better at dancing than somebody who comes from a background where math is promoted or science, right? The arts versus the practicality, studies, right? Those are equality is based on equally interested parties. So if you're not as equally interested in dancing as the Russian ballerina, then guess what? You're going to perform not as well. If your culture is not centered around the Russian dance theory, then you are going to perform poorly, or your community or your culture will perform poorly in that category, and that is not your fault. It also is not relevant. It's not relevant. It's not. It's just, there's no reason that because your culture is into, maybe while the Russians have ballerinas, the Italians have the islands of Sardinia, where they make some of the most outlawed delicious cheese on the planet, where they spend years in shacks, like cultivating cheese for 10 years at a time, and then you crack a wheel open of this cheese and it's still gooey past the hard exterior, and there's maggots still living in it, and if the maggots are dead, the cheese is bad. Like, and there's some art to that. Are the Russians good at making cheese? Oh, I'm sure they're good at making cheese, but they don't make the best cheese, right? The family of the Russian ballerina make the best cheese? No. But guess what? Statistically, they would not be the best cheesemakers. But they're not interested in making cheese. It's all equality of interest. And he goes into, men are not interested in staying home and giving birth to children. Because, first off, biologically they cannot. And it is just, there is a maternal instinct that is built into motherhood. And mothering children and the capability of giving birth, that more women are interested, unequally interested than men, in staying home and raising children. And Thomas Sowell brings that up, and he goes, guess what? So, but if you go women that are childrenless women compared to unmarried childrenless men in career fields, women outperform. They make more money. The problem is when you take women as a whole, that's married and unmarried, and then you lump them with men, married and unmarried, children and childrenless. And then you take the two major groups as a whole, men make more. Well, that's because a lot of women have an uninterest to careers, are less interested in careers than being stay-at-home moms and raising the children. And so what happens is that the dollar value per hour of the women lowers, and that's where you have the difference in wage standards. So, he points that out, chapter 10. Paranoia and freedom do not jive. So, what happens is if you have, if you're paranoid about things happening, gun murders, right? Like, I'm paranoid someone's gonna break into my house and shoot me. But guess what? The first instinct to people in paranoid about bad things happening, is to have somebody regulate it away. Don't let it happen. Don't let it happen. Don't let it happen. And so what happens is they sacrifice their freedoms to satisfy their paranoia. What is it, Benjamin Franklin? Those who want safety at the cost of their freedom deserve neither. Or something along those lines. I always paraphrase because I never get the quote quite right. But you get the gist of it. Success of others is a grievance rather than an example. Now he brings this up and he says that is the way things are going. Success of others is a grievance now. If your business is more successful than my business, I now hold that against you. Now, I don't, but there's people in this world that will hold that against you. You piece of shit making more money than everybody else. That means you stole it from somebody else. No, it's not how it works. The success of others is a grievance rather than an example. It should be an example. You should say, listen, that guy's business is doing great. That guy's business is doing great. I want to emulate or sit down with this person and talk with him and figure out what makes his business better than mine, why his business is successful, and what I can learn and lead. His example his or her example can teach me what I need to do to grow my business, right? Or they're very successful at child rearing, or they're very successful at public speaking, whatever it happens to be that they're successful at. That should be an example and not a grievance. But we're going down this path where everything is a grievance nowadays. We have a divorce of performance and reward. So by having these grievances, we're actually divorcing the two ideas of performance and reward. So if you have good performance, you should be rewarded by people not treating you like a piece of garbage for succeeding. Because what ends up happening is, you're like, why would I succeed? People are going to treat me like garbage. Which is actually happening nowadays with cancel culture. Because the culture changes like the wind, and then what happens is all of a sudden you just say the wrong thing, and your success is not static. Success is a slow build. I mean, it can be static, but most of it is a gradual incline. It's funny how quickly that can either plateau or skyrocket right down when you mix the staticness of cancel culture. Chapter 13. Promotion of reduction of options to slum dwellers. Okay, so what happened was, in the early 1900s, 1940s, there was a movement in the 1960s. He goes into all these different times where we reduce the option to slum dwellers. So you say, you live in substandard housing, we need to change that. Well, guess what? You're reducing their options, because right now their options are to feed their family or pay for the roof over their family's head. And by making their rent unattainable, by making a landlord who is renting to people that couldn't afford these houses, they couldn't afford to live in a house that wasn't substandard. Or so a third party says is substandard. Because substandard is all based on perspective, right? So to those people, it was dry, it was warm, and he brings up the different classes, like where, like, you know, like the poor of the poor, where they would have like 15 people to a floor, and they'd have to walk outside the building to go to the bathroom. You know, if you were in luxury, if you had a bathroom in the building you were in, and even more luxurious of an accommodation would be if it was on the same floor as you. And so he talks about that, and third parties need to be forced to live the trade-offs. So the trade-off in an economic standpoint is that they had to spend, those poor individuals had to spend more money because they raised the standard of housing. So now all of a sudden they have to spend more money to choose to live somewhere than to feed their family. Money's scarce, so they had to save money wherever they could, even without these changes. And then all of a sudden, some progressive comes in and says, no, we don't like this standard of... No. If there's one rat in your whole neighborhood, it should be condemned. So all of a sudden they're condemning housing. You have more people being homeless. That's the reason why nobody leaves, California when you're homeless, because they don't do anything to you, and you can't freeze to death on the streets. In New York City, you'd freeze to death. I mean, the book I'm reading now, the lady gave an example of when she was going to speak to the homeless, and a bunch of them didn't show up because the guy came in, he was like, hey, listen, there's not a lot of us going to come to your class today because, this lecture you're giving, because our friend Joe, the heat went out in the building, and the exhaust grate that he sleeps on no longer puts out this like warm steam, which to me sounds like carbon monoxide poisoning, but anyways, did not put out any warm steam, and he froze to death because it went out while he was sleeping, and he just froze to death on the grate. And it's like that shit can happen. Welcome to being homeless in Western New York, or in New York, or on the East Coast, the northern East Coast. Third-party observers know best, right? Yeah, right. No, they don't. And he says it's easy for formally educated people to believe what they know is best. But that's not true. No, that's not true. And so who's to say that the housing, the equitable housing movement, the standard of living movement for housing, substandard housing, it would have taken, because he references different statistics from different areas where there was no standard substandard housing movements, and those places actually got up to par faster and had this. They ended up at the same place, but one ended up there faster, and it was the place that was not pushing substandard housing, because the market will regulate that as the amenities, as what is it? High tides will raise all boats. Is that what it is? It's something along those lines. All boats get risen by the tide. That's it. That's how it is. So the poor of yesteryear, where the tide was down here, guess what? Now all of the amenities and all the great luxuries have lifted everybody. So even though some boats are taller than others, and you might not hold a candle to that boat, you're still riding the tide as they go too. People need to remember that. And this is a good reminder book. Probably one of my favorite of all time is this book. Leave it to me to staple crap together. It says Chapter 13 continued. It's also easy for future observers to look back and judge that it was better for certain decisions to be made. Was it? Was it really? Housing reform commandeered resources to make third parties feel better. That, listen, I'm pretty much explaining you Chapter 13. Then I pretty much wrote down all the other chapters after that. Housing increases with rising incomes. And then he brings up Southern blacks versus the immigrant slums. So there was housing reform during the immigrant slums, but the Southern blacks did not have such luxuries. And they are all on the same. No evidence that the Crusade laws were effective. So they all ended up at the same place in a relatively similar time period, and I believe the Southern blacks ended up there first, according to Thomas Sowell. So it's easy to barb at shops selling goods from third world nations. Okay, so you barb Walmart, for example, or a mom and pop shop that maybe buys to try to compete with Walmart. They buy from a third world nation, right? They buy trinkets from a third world nation, and you say, I'm not going to buy those trinkets. They're from a third world nation, and that supports child labor and blah, 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 blah. Well, here's what else he goes on to say. It says it's easy to barb at those places and not shop there. But nothing hurts the third world more than the helpful boycotts. See, you boycott the store to hurt the mom and pop shop or hurt the Walmart or hurt wherever. Nothing hurts those third world countries more than you being helpful and boycotting them. Because now they're not buying their products. So now they're working for a penny an hour, and no one's paying them for their goods. So now their penny an hour is worth less and less. They're getting less hours. So these are all, economics can solve most of our political issues today. Proper capitalistic economics. So if you look at life from an economic, Thomas Sowell, economist standpoint, and you have this knowledge of scarcity and the market and people's judgments and all sorts of, how people react to the market and how people make choices and things like that, and then relate it to the dollar and economics, you can solve almost all life's problems because the market will self-regulate. And one of the easiest examples that economics handles all that for us is by showing that economics, but that government has no place in our economy. Right? It's not economical for us all, from an economic standpoint, it's not economical to find who murdered somebody else. But it is. It doesn't seem like it is, but if all of a sudden people are afraid they're going to get murdered, then your price of goods goes up. Because now they're worried about those truck drivers getting shot. Now they're worried about having to increase in guns, right? So there's a lot of different things that plays into effect in the market. the government threatens to take guns away from people. Guess what? There's an artificial spike in the cost of guns because people think they're going away. It's all economics. Almost all of everything can be defined from an economic standpoint. Does that mean that's the end all be all? No, but you can find a lot of knowledge and a lot of answers to these governmental problems just by following economics and not politicians. Reading guys like Thomas Sowell is probably one of the greatest things that you could do to be an informed American. And I truly mean that. So, I'm going to get back to it. We have almost a page left of notes that I have written. We have chapter 14. I'm almost done with 13. We have chapter 14 and notes from 16 and 17 to get through. So, just enforcing versus work conditions would also price them out of work. Okay, so if you enforced all the standards of American values and how our work ethic and work conditions would be, and our working conditions, if you enforced all that on third world countries, you would price them out of the market. Now they wouldn't be making anything. Then their price of dollar, like if you have a shop making $0 an hour, how much can you pay the employees? The employees should be paid on a cost-benefit analysis based on their work ethic and all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, it's also on what you're selling your products for. If you're selling your products at zero, that means your costs should be zero, which means that you're splitting your cost of $0 between your input materials, your cost of goods sold, and your labor. So now you got to now the cost of zero has to be split, whatever percentage it is for the cost of goods sold is now zero, and the labor is now zero. Now you're paying everybody zero. That's just economics. If you're selling it for $1 and you have a fixed cost of 30 cents an item, and that leaves you 70 cents out of that item to pay for labor. And that's barring any fixed costs of running the business, right? Like the overhead maintenance on the buildings that manufacture your widget or whatever. You're just simplistically you're just saying I have 70 cents I can pay. And let's say that employee can make 10 widgets an hour. Well, that's $3. That's $10 you're bringing in. It's $3 in costs, leaving you $7. Now, assuming you're not taking any profit, that employee is making $7 an hour. You can't pay him $8 because now you're losing money and you go out of business. Now they're making $0 an hour. See, that's economics. You can solve a lot of things with economics. You can't just inflate the price. You can't tell me that I have to pay more than $1 for that because I ain't gonna buy it. Now you're getting $0 off of that instead of $1. Because I'm not buying something that I don't think is worth $1 or more than $1. And you could gripe and you could say, well, what if it was worth $1.10? And yeah, okay, maybe I'll bite. But you tell me it's worth $2. You're doubling the price of it. No, go kick rocks. That's how economics works because it's all based on the choices of the consumer and the choices of the investors and the choices of the labor worker who could also be the consumer. It's very complicated. No one man or woman or human being can completely understand the market in its entirety. And assume that they can understand and wrap their brains around every single person out there making the decisions of the market. That's why I can't remember who talked about this. I think it was Ben Shapiro was talking about that they shouldn't have a large group of people. No, maybe it was in this book. Large group of people should not be running the government, saying that they know what's best for everybody because they're all great, smart economists, right? Because like even that has been thrown out by a famous great economist, and now I can't remember who the hell I heard it from that said it, because then they quoted the guy. Yeah. Anyways, back to the book. Subjecting whole populations to the fancies of the intellectuals is deadly. That lesson has been written in blood across the 20th century, and surely the time is overdue to read it. So, intellectuals say that this is the way to do things. Socialism, right? And that's what he's getting at. He's saying that, we need utopia, and we need this, and we need that. And that's what intellectuals do. They sit there and tell you how you need to live your life, how the best way of doing it is. We got it all planned out for you, don't worry. And what ends up happening is Thomas is pointing out that if you subject an entire whole population to the fancies of the intellectuals, this is deadly. And he's referring to that lesson is written, and this is the quote, that lesson has been written in blood across the 20th century, and surely the time is overdue to read it. Read that message. Do not do this. And he's referring to Soviet Russia, just every socialist state, communist China, socialism, communism, all those things. Those are all intellectual ideas that have not come to fruition, and intellectuals still think that they're going to work, even though they're failed. And he points that out. Visions are cloudy. Rent control is bunk. Why would making food or health care not be bunk as well? Now, the bunk word, that might be me. So, he's saying people's visions are cloudy. So, rent control doesn't work. Rent control, rent control causes housing shortages. Look at New York City. So it causes housing shortages, and then he pointed out one other thing, and now I can't remember what the hell it was. But so why would the government regulating food or healthcare not also create shortages? And then he references other countries that has this done. He says there was a quote, or there was an old saying about the well-intended person. The well-intended person asks whether or not it is water or gasoline he tosses on the economic fire. But whether it he asks whether or not he does not ask whether or not it is water or gasoline he tosses on the economic fire, but whether it is a well-intended act. It's the blindness of a vision, right? So you want to toss gasoline on the economic fire, not water on it. You want your economy to be exploding, right? You don't want to just piss on it. But it's a well-intended act. It doesn't matter. It ain't. Two things are inversely related, or not related at all. Will I do well on my math homework today? I understand my science. They have two different results because they're different apples and oranges. Okay, chapter 16. Anti-discrimination, disabled people through no fault of their own being made whole again at others' expenses. And then he goes into an entire example of somebody being hired and how laws, was it reasonably, was that person they're not allowed to ask whether the person has a disability, whether it's mental or whatever, but then what happens if it greatly affects the business? And so what happens is they have to now hire more insurance and lower the wages, the value of the wages on people, or raise the products on the consumer, or what have you, all because of these. And then these companies were being sued back in the 90s, and he said it's ridiculous that you can sue somebody because the employee did something, and that's the now liability of the company because their employee killed somebody or did something dumb or whatever based on their disability that they're not allowed to ask or question or anything. And if there's an issue where they need a reasonable accommodation, they were also being sued by a team of lawyers from those individuals, the ambulance chasing lawyers, and they would sue those companies. And those companies would say, listen, why would I, we gave them reasonable accommodations. No, you didn't. Well, what is reasonable? Well, reasonable is subjective. And the laws are made to be subjective because there's made to be no answer. And that's how they solve the problem. The politicians solve the problem by making it subjective and very lax. And what happens is the lawyers jumped on those loopholes and sued the daylights out of the employers, and the employers either closed up shop or became very strict and worked on loopholes of their own, and it was one of those things. What are you going to do? So that's another economic injustice, right? That the cosmic justice is that everyone should be treated the same at an employment, but the truth of the matter is that why should the expense of the non-afflicted be paying an expense for somebody else's issue? Right, that's what he's trying to point out, is the difference between cosmic justice and traditional justice. After the fact, against the employers, right? Okay, so essentially it became legalized extortion, and it also generated no faith in the legal system. He also points out how there is differences in people. There's the people that is the professional, the technician, the person who knows something, right? So the lords versus the serfs. The serfs wouldn't have a place to live if there wasn't a lord that owned the land that they could work. And then it has to be respected. Not to say that there isn't disparities between those different things, but he relates it to the IT guy versus the general population. So if you have somebody who has, they don't have to take, if you're going to treat them like art, if you're going to treat people that are more knowledgeable or have something better to bring to the like your TV breaks, guess what? Screw you, you can go buy a new one. Or your IT system goes down at work. Well, screw you can find a new job because we're not paying. You know what I mean? Like, why would I bring something to market you're going to vilify me for? So, these people have great worth, and you pay them accordingly. And why do they have a difference in wealth? Is because they have a difference in knowledge and passion and what they're good at. And he brings the modern day IT guy up because it's somebody who understands something that you don't understand, and you're paying them because of their understanding. And that's what he points out from an economic standpoint. Property and investors must be free to invest without limit. And I wrote both ways. So that means without limit of investing, and investing their money or their options, and accumulation. Oh, okay, accumulation and expending. So that's what drives the market. The market is that you don't have to worry about, well, I have to worry about how much money I make because they're going to take half of it. Or I can only make so much because the government takes the rest. Or whatever happens, right? Like, you can't put a cap on somebody's earning potential. Because if you do, then what's their incentive to take those risks to invest or to own if they can't accumulate and then continue to expend? So you need to give people the ability to expend as much as they want, as long as they have it, and to accumulate as much as they want, because that's just what's going to drive the market. And he points that out. And there's been issues where the government is capping all of that. And I believe we referenced this in the chapter 14 notes. Rent control is bunk. Price-controlled food equals mass hunger. French Revolution. He brings quotes. Or he brings references. Rent control equals housing shortage. New York City. Medical care equals long lines and lists to be seen on set operations. So you get on a list to be seen by a doctor for your whatever your ailment is. So long lines. It's just you might, if it's important, you might die in line for somebody who has the sniffles or, needs to have something minor reattached, or you know what I mean. Like, and in the meantime, the guy who needs something reattached is probably the thing's dead. You gotta throw it away now. So he points that out. A judge. Oh, okay. So here is an Oliver Wendell Holmes reference or quote. A judge cannot. So he's Oliver Wendell Holmes is having lunch with a fellow judge, and he says, "Do justice, sir." And Oliver turns his coach around or whatever. He's from a long time ago. So turns his coach around and says, "It is not my job." Okay. This is what a judge cannot do justice directly, is what Thomas Sowell says, and then he leads into this. It is my job to apply the law, not to do justice. So So a lot of the second half of chapter 16 talks about how the judicial system is weighing on America because it's being manipulated into not what it is. A judge is not supposed to do justice. A judge's job is to interpret the law or apply it, and not have a separate agenda and manipulate the legal system using misinterpretation of the law. Ooh. We're running low on time here, guys. I'm about to lose my video. So, subject to edicts of unelected judges enforcing constantly evolving standards. The judges are more heedless by the moral superiority of those of the most dangerous ways. Towering presumptions are threatening the freedoms of all Americans. So he's worried about it as well. So yeah, we do have to cap this off. Holy smokes. Damn, camera. Chapter 17. Freedom is more likely to be eroded away than last all at once. Oh yeah, than lost all at once. Freedom has been bought and sold for words or money or both. Thomas Sowell's book. I recommend all of you guys read it, and don't forget to like and subscribe, folks. I want to pop off here before we lose the footage, but I'm testing out the new Sony, and I guess we're testing it on her Max, so she had a fresh battery when I got here. So, all right, gang, we will talk to you guys soon, and don't forget to get out there and get your copy of Cosmic Justice and see how 25 years has not changed a damn thing. Thanks, guys. See you soon.